Hey, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Very honored to be here with you as part of the Civil War Roundtable Congress. And like you, I have certainly enjoyed some of the previous presentations and speakers, really some great subjects. And tonight I'm going to talk about maybe a lesser known subject, and that is James Longstreet's First Corps and their operations in East Tennessee, which took place in the fall of '63 and into the cold winter months of 1864. As many of you probably know, Longstreet departed Virginia in early September '64, bound for Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee to take on William Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland. They left in such a hurry that many of the soldiers simply carried what they could fit in their haversacks and carry with them. So, not a lot of cold weather gear for sure that they would command would certainly regret in those cold winter days in January, February in East Tennessee. But they joined Braxton Bragg's army, victorious there in Chickamauga, then move on to Chattanooga. And then, of course, follow on to that, Longstreet into East Tennessee as well. So this is the agenda I'll be following. Relationship between Bragg and Longstreet was certainly started out rough and certainly did not get better over time. Grant arrives in mid-October in Chattanooga. Bragg had sort of a partial siege, I guess you could say, around the city. In October 27th, one of Grant's first directives was to reopen the Union supply line, what he called the Cracker Line, which he successfully did at Brown's Ferry. And then subsequent to that was the Battle of Wauhatchie, which was a sort of a botched Confederate operation, which I'll go into later. But the relationship only worsens between Bragg and Longstreet. President Davis and Bragg correspond with each other, and Davis recommends that Bragg send Longstreet north up to Knoxville to take on Ambrose Burnside's Department of the Ohio, Army of the Ohio, which Bragg thinks that's a great idea. Get rid of Longstreet, get him out of our command. So Longstreet does so, is unable to take Knoxville, and ends up going into winter quarters in East Tennessee. But it was during this period, especially around the Knoxville time frame and afterwards, that Longstreet experiences some serious command issues with Lafayette McLaws, Evander Law, as well as Jerome Robertson, which I will get in towards the end of the presentation. It's our task organization. Lafayette McLaws had known Longstreet for a very long time, but their relationship also sort of got worse after the Battle of Gettysburg. Does not personally arrive for the Battle of Chickamauga, arrives afterwards. But these are his brigades, of course, and many familiar to you. On the other side, Evander MacIver Law and Brigadier General Micah Jenkins, both South Carolinians that served as instructors together. But Law moves into command, like you all know, many of you know, when Hood is wounded on that Thursday, July 2nd. And Law essentially was division commander all the way up through Gettysburg, the movement down into Chickamauga. Hood is seriously wounded on September 20th. Law is again in command, commended by Longstreet for his actions at Chickamauga. But then Micah Jenkins arrives. Longstreet thought very highly of Jenkins, had a good, solid reputation. And so the battle over who would command the division commences. Data rank was a big issue in the Civil War, especially with general officers. Micah Jenkins's data rank was July of '62. Evander Law a few months later in October. And I think one thing that probably Longstreet did not expect was the backlash that he received with appointing Jenkins as division commander. The soldiers and officers were loyal to Law. He was, part of that organization. And you can certainly well understand that Jenkins was seen as an outsider of not only the division, but also of the Corps itself. And so he had that going against them. And I don't think Longstreet really anticipated that. Law even approached a recuperating Hood to try and get him on his side, but Hood did not yield to his request. He recognized the data rank issue as well as recognizing that Jenkins had a solid reputation as a fighter. Richmond authorities did not really intervene until February of '64, and so this issue just festered and grew over weeks and over a couple of months as to who would really, truly, permanently command the division. So we look at some orientry of the terrain here. Of course, we have Chattanooga down here at the bottom. There were two railroads that were very critical in this area. One ran from Knoxville to Cleveland just outside of Chattanooga, which was the East Tennessee-Georgia line. And at Cleveland, it branched off. One went directly into Chattanooga. The other one went into Dalton, Georgia, where, of course, Braxton Bragg withdrew when Grant captured Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge. The other line was the East Tennessee and Virginia line, which ran from Knoxville up to Bristol, Virginia. And I guess the simplest way to put that is that line really connected the Eastern theaters with the Western theaters in terms of moving supplies and men. Part of the region was a major supplier of salt and lead and copper, which the Confederacy certainly well needed. And East Tennessee was very pro-unionist, had been almost since the start of the war, something both Lincoln and Davis recognized. Lincoln spoke about that often, the importance of keeping that area, that region on the pro-union side, and Davis obviously, conversely, for opposite reasons. But in early November, Bragg dispatches Longstreet north to take on Knoxville and Ambrose Burnside's Army of the Ohio. But he attaches also Joseph Wheeler's Cavalry Corps, which had about 5,000 troopers, about 12 pieces of artillery. He was very familiar with the area. So coupled with Longstreet's 2 divisions, E.P. Alexander's 23 guns, as well as another battalion of 12 guns, roughly had about 15,000 men in his organization. To Longstreet, Bragg, the mission was simple. He said, quote, to drive Burnside out of East Tennessee, first or better to capture or destroy him. Bragg also wanted to put a tight leash on Longstreet. Knowing the aggressiveness and reputation of Grant, Bragg emphasized, I may need to call you rather quickly in case of an emergency, so keep that in mind. But speed was of the essence for Longstreet. Go up there, take care of Burnside, and come back and support me. Burnside as well had roughly about 15,000 soldiers, but these men were widely scattered throughout various outposts, of course, occupied Knoxville. But the movement north out of Chattanooga was arduous at best. Going up to Sweetwater here, you can see there, many of the soldiers simply marched out of Chattanooga. The trains they were able to take were inefficient at best, as one officer described it. Trains going up steep inclines couldn't make it, so the soldiers had to disembark, get off and walk up the incline, and then get back on the trains at the top of the hill to carry on their journey. So very difficult. And if you ever want to read some interesting correspondence between Bragg and Longstreet during this period, early November, quite comical. Accusations flying back and forth, blaming one another for the supply issues and et cetera. It just made a relationship that much worse. So approaching Knoxville, the Battle of Campbell Station on November 16th. And this is again where Jenkins and Law butt heads once again. According to Jenkins and supported by Longstreet, Law does not execute a flanking movement properly. Battle does not get the benefits that Longstreet and Jenkins were looking for. Burnside goes back into Knoxville. But again, the tension still between the two commanders, Jenkins and Law, continues to grow. So with Burnside at Knoxville, he's really achieving what he wanted to do, what Grant wanted him to do, draw Longstreet further away from Chattanooga so he could not quickly return back when Grant decides to take actions against Bragg. So Burnside's doing what he needs to do. So we have the city of Knoxville. The city had taken a pounding since the war's beginning, occupied by both Union and Confederates at various times. There was pretty much nothing left of the city itself. Almost every building was stripped. Anything of useful that the forces could take down, they did. One author described it, quote, "There was not a chicken coop or fence to be found. Lawns were gone, confiscated homes were in disrepair, and all the churches except St. John's were used as barracks or hospitals. Plus, there were many refugees in the city as well, so Burnside had to take that into account when developing his defensive plan. And the city itself was situated about 150 feet above the Holston River you see here in the photographs. Burnside has laid his defensive work out, which started north of the town and worked its way down towards the river and towards the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. And there was a series of small creeks that intersected the city, which he also used as part of his defensive framework. And kind of a map showing these defenses here is a series of redoubts, earthworks, forts, and artillery positions. The strongest was Fort Loudon off to the west, renamed Fort Sanders, you see there on the slide, after a Union cavalry soldier killed at the Battle of Campbell Station. But it was the highest point, surrounded by abatis and a rather intimidating ditch. And Longstreet recognized, because that was the highest point, if he could take Fort Sanders, then he could probably very well force Burnside completely out of the city itself. And he would certainly be successful in his mission there. A partial siege, I guess you could call it, takes place, but because of the pro-unionist sentiment amongst the population and surrounding counties, they were able to assist Burnside with resupplying his men with food and forage. And so that really was not a problem for him. And we see some pictures here of Fort Sanders itself. One historian called it a quote, "a formidable fortress." I guess you could call it analogous to about the size of a football field, maybe a little larger in some areas. Had a ditch, a bastion faces 12 feet wide. The ditch was about 7 feet deep in some places, deeper in some parts as well. The ground sloped downward towards the railroad tracks about 800 feet. And you can see from the slides here, they had taken down all the trees, leaving these 12 to 15-inch stumps. And Captain Orlando Poe, who was one of Burnside's engineers, had found some telegraph wire, rusted as it was, several spools that he used to wrap around the stumps. And because it was rusted, it kind of blended in with some of the pine leaves that lie littered around the ground. And so hoped to use as an entanglement for any Confederate assault against the fort. At least that was the hope. Had roughly about 500 soldiers, several artillery pieces inside the fort. And Longstreet had set the assault to take place on November 21st. But there was a series of delays, delay after delay, weather, units expected to arrive to reinforce Longstreet. One of Bragg's engineers, Chief Engineer General Ledbetter, arrives and has different courses of action for Longstreet to consider. And so it's almost a week plus, November 29th, before the assault actually takes place. But during the time when General Ledbetter was there, they are taking Longstreet and his staff and commanders are taking a reconnaissance mission around looking at Burnside's defenses. And as they come back to Longstreet's headquarters and they're passing Fort Sanders, Longstreet spies through his glasses a Union soldier walk across the ditch. And what Longstreet sees is that the ditch, to him, to his eyes, his observations, is only about up to his waist. Longstreet erroneously thinks that that's how deep the ditch is, not thinking that the soldier had actually walked across a plank to cross the ditch area. And so this would come back to haunt him in his planning for the assault on Fort Sanders later on. And the assault itself, November 29th. McLaws was to make the assault with 3 of his brigades, a 4th used to exploit the breakthrough. Micah Jenkins would follow an echelon to the left. And Micah Jenkins had concerns. On the night of the 28th and early morning of the 29th, he had spoken to a senior Confederate commander who was familiar with Knoxville and who told him about the depth and the width of the ditches. Micah Jenkins was concerned because he knew they had no ladders with them, no device to cross the ditch and to get up the parapet walls, the bastion walls. Jenkins goes to McLaws, and E.P. Alexander expresses his concerns. they sort of brush him off and saying, you know, why don't you just write Longstreet your concerns, express those to him. And Longstreet writes back to Jenkins on the morning of the 29th, and this is what he says, quote, "Keep your men well at their work and do not listen to the idea of failing. We shall not fail. If we go in with the idea that we shall fail, we will be sure to do so. But no men who are determined to succeed can fail. Let me urge you not to entertain such feelings for a moment. Do not let anyone fail or anything." And that is what Jenkins was left with. Orders were orders, and he saw what was going to take place. Now, E.P. Alexander had a very strong, robust role in initial planning for taking of the fort with his 30-plus guns. And you can imagine a football-sized field, guns pounding from every angle. It could make it could be pretty destructive, especially with the competency of Alexander. However, in the late hours, that plan changed, much to the consternation of Alexander himself. His guns would be used only to signal the advance of the infantry. That was it. There was no pre-bombardment of the fort itself, hour or two, whatever it was, just a few minutes. And Alexander wrote after, he said, quote, "The tactical formation was merely 3 brigades abreast in line of battle, just what it would have been if a force were attacking in a wheat field." And that was his frustration. The Union also had made preparations as well. Lieutenant Samuel Benjamin commanded the artillery inside the fort, and he had put together, he had used cannon shells with very much shortened fuses to use as hand grenades against the soldiers once they were in the ditch and trying to get up the parapet walls. They poured water down the sides of the bastion walls to freeze over the night, the temperature below freezing or near freezing. And so you had frozen walls that soldiers would have to try and climb up 7, 8, 10 feet in some places. And of course, I mentioned the telegraph wire. So the Confederate assault, columns of regiments versus a line formation, about 6,000 soldiers in all. And McLaws determined, he ordered that the soldiers were not to fire their weapons when making the 800 feet or so across the line. He wanted the soldiers' weapons prepared to fire once they got through the ditch, on the parapet walls, and firing down into the fort itself. Thought it was just too much time to try and fire and reload on the run, etc. But the bottom line is the attack was a failure. Took place in some of the dark hours, the cold, because of the terrain and how it kind of, I guess, forced some units in towards each other. The units became intermixed. Commanders got confused. One correspondent who viewed it called it a, quote, scene of confusion and discordance of pandemonium. The Union had also used Roman candles that also, I guess you could say, heightened the fear of the Confederate soldiers that were, accumulating in the ditch, not sure where to go, how to get up the parapet walls. There were a few that made it to the top. The 13th and the 16th Georgia and the 17th Mississippi were able to plant their flags on top of the walls of the fort. The commander of the 16th Georgia put his hand on a cannon, muzzle of a cannon, demanded its surrender. The Union soldiers simply yelled out fire and blew the Georgia officer to bits. His flag falling inside the fort. But Longstreet determined that future assaults were really futile. Some Confederate officers begged to differ and thought maybe a second assault could have really made the difference and they could have taken the fort. But messages soon began to arrive that Grant had defeated Bragg at Chattanooga and that Bragg had withdrawn to Dalton, Georgia. Joseph Wheeler had gone back to rejoin Bragg prior to the operations in Knoxville, and he sends a note to Longstreet from Ringgold, Georgia, that says, quote, "General Bragg desires me to say he wishes you to fall back with your command upon Dalton, if possible. But if you find that impracticable, he thinks you will have to fall back towards Virginia." And Longstreet actually makes preparation to go to Dalton, starts stocking some of the railroad cars, starts directing orders to his commanders to prepare for movement. But then he just determines the terrain, the march is just not going to do it, and He just feels it best to stay in the Knoxville area, and that's what he does. But then shortly thereafter, word arrives that William T. Sherman, is en route from Chattanooga. And so Longstreet in early December decides it's time to pitch the flags and head northeast into winter quarters in East Tennessee, and that's exactly what he does. Historian and Longstreet biographer Jeffrey Wirt called East Tennessee a bitter place, and that's exactly what it was. And so with the Battle of Knoxville over, I'm going to get into some of the legal challenges, problems that Longstreet encountered, and the first one is with Mr. Lafayette McLaws. Longstreet relieved McLaws of his command on December 17th, and these were the three charges that were filed against McLaws. The first two were dismissed, and these all are in really for the attack on Fort Loudon / Fort Sanders is what it has to do with. Failed to align sharpshooters prior to the assault, and you can see the second one there. The third one, not providing the assaulting columns with ladders, was the only charge that really stuck from the court-martial that was conducted, and I'll go into that here on the next slide. Delays over several weeks. Commanders were needed for various operations that were going on in East Tennessee. So the board would meet, dismiss, meet again. Finally, at the end of March 17th, the court-martial finalized, completed this work. Historian Alexander Mendoza said of the charges, quote, "The charges against McLaws had a poor foundation. Although he failed to exhibit confidence in Longstreet's plan, the general had carried out his orders. The attack on Fort Sanders was simply ill-conceived. At the end of the day, the suspension of rank and pay for 60 days was overturned by authorities in Richmond, but McLaws was done in Longstreet's court. He was sent to the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and good old Joseph Kershaw took command of the division. Evander Law. Again, as I've indicated, Law and Jenkins had butted heads since pretty much Jenkins' arrival after Chickamauga. At the Battle of Waxahachie, Law had been accused of withdrawing early from that battle. And then I had mentioned the failed flanking movement at the Battle of Campbell Station on November 16th. And then, of course, the bickering over who actually commanded the division. Authorities in Richmond not really deciding that for sure. But on December 19th, just a few days after the charges preferred against McLaws, Law submitted his resignation. He desired to go to Richmond to submit the resignation himself. Longstreet allowed him to do so, but once he got there, speaking to several individuals, including John Bell Hood, he decided to tear up his resignation letter and return back to Virginia and East Tennessee. But as this was going on, as Law was absent in Richmond, officers of the brigade had petitioned Longstreet to allow his brigade officers to go into Alabama and Georgia for a recruiting effort. Longstreet didn't buy it. He thought they were just trying to shirk their duty and get away from dangerous duty for the Confederacy. And Longstreet suspected that two events were connected: Law's resignation going to Richmond, and then what the officers were doing here for this petition. And so he had the brigade officers submit to him in writing what their intent was. And on December 26th, they submitted their responses. But one officer in particular indicated that Law had desired for the petition to go through. And for Longstreet, that sealed the deal, that there was a connection between the two events. The brigade had also submitted William Perry should command the brigade, which Jenkins and Longstreet endorsed. But Law was on leave until March 1st, and when he returned, Longstreet had him arrested, obtaining leave under false purposes. Another charge that Longstreet preferred on him was that because Law had destroyed his letter of resignation, it was written on official Confederate letterhead, that he had broken the law there as well. So that charge was preferred. But at the end of the day, y'all, Richmond was pretty much fed up with this whole situation and retained Law back in command. And Davis was frustrated with Longstreet as well at this point and said, quote, "General Longstreet had seriously offended against good order and military discipline and rearrested an officer who had been released by the War Department without any new offensive having been alleged. Emphasized that if Law had made these allegations or conducted these errors at Wauhatchie or Campbell Station, Longstreet should have taken action right then and there. But he didn't. But Law is restored to command. He's actually wounded at Cold Harbor. And upon his recovery, he is transferred to the cavalry, which is what he wanted to do in the first place. Now we have Jerome Robertson, the famed Texas Brigade. Had also found disfavor with Jenkins. And this culminated the Battle of Bean Station, which was a small action that occurred in East Tennessee. He had become very distraught. He was seen as a commander of reputation of really caring for his men. They recognized that. But he was very distraught over the conditions that the soldiers are going through. Lack of food, lack of supplies, and again, going back to what they failed to bring with them from Virginia. And then exclaiming for all to hear, including his commanders, his superiors, that he would not move his men unless he received written orders. To Micah Jenkins, he said, quote, "This is highly prejudicial to good order and discipline." Longstreet agreed and endorsed the charges. There was a very short trial that took place in February. However, there is no actual record of the proceedings. And apparently, by all accounts, Richmond had simply dismissed the charges. But Robertson was gone from Longstreet's corps. He was set packing. John Gregg took over. He had been wounded at Chickamauga, so he took over a couple months later. But Robertson departed for Texas and to command the state's reserves in June of '64. And finally, Richmond was able to resolve the division command issue when they appointed Major General Charles Field, a 35-year-old commander, to command the division finally in February after all this time. And I'm pretty sure he commanded the division all the way up to Appomattox. So we have the Battle of the Wilderness. Longstreet at the end of April returns back to Lee's army, is very well received, welcomed by Lee. There is a full military review over a field of about 100 acres, and took several hours for the soldiers to march in review. One soldier from the 13th Mississippi said, quote, "After 7 unhappy months and disastrous months in Georgia and Tennessee, they were once again back in Virginia." Another soldier said, quote, "Felt as if the right arm in the army had been restored." But Longstreet is wounded at the Battle of Wilderness in a neck and shoulder area, recuperates and rejoins Lee in October of '64 there at Petersburg. And as you probably all well know, he fights the lost causers for many years after the war, publishes his memoirs in December of '95, marries Helen Longstreet a couple years later, and then dies short of his 83rd birthday in January of 1904. And you see there, Micah Jenkins is killed as well. And so this is all going to be part of a book I hope to have published, The Challenges of Command, Longstreet's First Corps from Gettysburg to East Tennessee. Should be out in the fall. I know Salvis is working on it, but I think they've had some delays with everything that's been going on lately. But it's due for release this fall. But I'm happy at this point to take any of your questions. And I appreciate your attention and wish you all the best and stay safe out there. Thank you very much.